C3.1.6, sensory neurons and conveying information. Key understanding: input to the spinal cord and cerebral hemispheres through sensory neurons. Students should understand that sensory neurons convey messages from receptor cells to the central nervous system. So from receptor cell in the finger, like touch, up to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. The beginning of a sensory neural pathway begins with a receptor. Okay, so spot number one, receptor. At the beginning of a sensory neural pathway. So we're going to go on a journey. We're going to get on a path and follow it. And our starting point is a receptor. A receptor is a modified neuron that is capable of transduction. Transduction is the conversion of a physical stimulus into an electrical signal called an action potential that is carried along a neuron. Each type of receptor is specialized to transduce one specific type of physical stimulus. Okay, so before we talked about receptors that take on chemical signals, like ligands and whatnot, right? Okay, well, this is similar, but now we're talking about receptors that receive physical information or stimulus to send then it sends on which starts the electrical signal. Okay, so before we talked about how this electrical signal or the action potential goes through the neuron and how it then gets transferred to a chemical process across the synapse and then carry on. So we talked about this neuron to neuron or neuron to muscular process of the pathway. But now we're talking about the sensory neurons and how they start the signal. Okay. The retinal cells of the eyes, so retinal or retina, that has to do with the eyes. The retinal cells of the eyes transduce light. Thermoreceptors in your skin transduce heat or lack of heat. Baroreceptors transduce pressure. There are many other receptor types as well. The neurons that carry impulses from receptors to the brain or the spinal cord are called the sensory neurons. Okay, so motor neurons take the response from the brain and spinal cord, from the central nervous system, back out, right? Those are the motor neurons. The sensory neurons are the ones that send the information in. And there are many different types of receptors, sensory receptors, that accept information. So we just mentioned the retinal cells, okay? We talked about the thermoreceptors in your skin, the baroreceptors also. Pretty sure we're going to go in a little bit more detail on each of these, okay? The quantity and variety, we're over in the little purple box here, pink box. The quantity and variety of sensory information being sent to your brain at any given movement is vast. In fact, most sensory information has to be filtered out as unimportant by a process called sensory gating. Like a gate, to stop something from coming in. Sensory gating. At this moment, try to make yourself aware of some of the sensory information that previously you were subconsciously filtering by sensory gating. This may include sights, sounds, things you were touching, temperature, sensory information, and a great deal more. So let's think. Okay, if I think about things. For example, now I feel where my feet are touching the ground. I'm just wearing socks. And I can feel how my feet are. I can feel a little bit of tension in my back. Now I hear the refrigerator going. I hear a kind of hum of something else. What else am I aware of? Okay, now I'm aware of like the fabric on my skin. Right, so I wasn't aware of these things when I was reading to you because I wasn't thinking about them. I was filtering them out. There was sensory gating going on. Okay, and none of those things reached kind of like a demanding threshold enough to like grab my attention. Okay, I can also feel like maybe it's just a little bit cold in here, but not enough to really bother me. Sensory gating. If it was colder, then it would probably pass that gate, right, and grab my attention, and I might go put on a sweater. Example of a specific sensory path. The skin of your fingertips contains mechanoreceptors that sense pressure, okay? So if I go like this, I feel this pressure on my fingers, that's my mechanoreceptors. When you touch your phone screen to type a message, the mechanoreceptors at the tips of your fingers and thumb send action potentials up the small nerves in your hand and arm to eventually join one of the 31 spinal nerves. Specifically, the action potentials travel to a spinal nerve that enters your spinal cord in the region of your chest. The neurons that carry this information into the gray matter of the spinal cord but are directed out into the white matter. Okay, the neurons that carry this information enter the gray matter of the spinal cord but are directed out into the white matter. Okay, that's interesting. So the neurons, they come into the gray matter and then are directed out into the white matter. You should see figure 2. Here, let's look at this picture. A photograph of a section of the human spinal cord. Oh, that's what it looks like if you cut down it and look at it. In the center, the darker butterfly shape is the gray matter of the spinal cord, capable of integration processing. Outside the gray matter is white matter, which carries impulses to and from the brain. The pathway of this spinal cord neuron carries the impulses up through your spinal cord, through the brainstem, and into the parietal lobe of your cerebrum. That was back here, remember? So you got the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe. Okay. This is where the sense of touch is interpreted or integrated. Okay, so the sense of touch is handled in the parietal lobe. You are aware of this sensation, thus it is a conscious process. Yes, we are aware of touch. Although it is only one sensation of many that you would be experiencing at that moment. It's true. Each receptor that we perceive at the conscious level, so being aware of it, has a specific pathway to the CNS. That's the central nervous system, CNS. Many receptors send their action potentials to a particular lobe of the cerebrum. For example, information from sound mechanoreceptors travels to the temporal lobe. Information from chemoreceptors for taste travel to the parietal lobe. Information from photoreceptors for visual information travels to the occipital lobe. Okay, so the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe is kind of here, I guess. Yeah. I guess I can show you in this section. Okay, so we've got Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. In this picture, let's look at this picture. A colorized scanning electron micrograph of a small section of the retina of an eye. Ooh, this is a picture from an eye. Okay. The photoreceptors of the retina are shown. Rod cells, oh, they really look like rods. A rod, like a fishing rod. A rod is like a long cylinder. A long skinny cylinder. Rod cells that contains black and white vision are shown in blue. They are rod-shaped. And cone cells responsible for color vision are shown in green. They are cone-shaped. Well, that's convenient, naming things after their shape. So we've got rods and cones. So rods process black and white, and cones process color. Motor neurons and muscle stimulation, C3.1.7. Key understanding, output from the cerebral hemispheres of the brain to muscles through motor neurons. Okay, so we just covered sensory neurons, which brings information to the CNS. And now we're going to talk about motor neurons, which take information from the CNS. Students should understand that muscles are stimulated to contract. Contract means whoop, like this. Relax, contract. The cerebrum, brain, that part of the brain, uses the sensory information it receives to make decisions concerning movements of your body. The action potentials are carried to muscle tissue by motor neurons. The portion of the cerebrum that sends the action potentials is called the motor cortex and is located in the most posterior, that means backside, posterior, portion of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, so the frontal lobe is from here basically to here, and the motor cortex is in the posterior side, to the back side of the frontal lobe. Okay, so the posterior side of the frontal lobe is where it sits next to the parietal lobe. Okay. Motor neurons terminate in muscle tissue. Terminate means they end there. Okay, so the motor neuron begins somewhere else, and then the end of it ends in the muscle tissue. Here's a light micrograph showing a single motor neuron axon branching to form multiple synapses with fibers of skeletal muscle. So these lines, these are the muscles. Okay, the fibers of the muscles. Each synapse is called a motor end plate, or you can also call it a neuromuscular junction. Okay. So each axon of a motor neuron branches repeatedly. Branches, like literally like a tree has branches. Okay, branches means branches like this, separates into different parts. Okay, so each axon of a motor neuron branches repeatedly and forms synapses with multiple fibers of a muscle. Okay, so one neuron has an axon, and the axon branches out, and then there's a synapse at the end of each branch, and those synapses connect with different fibers of a muscle. Motor neurons form synapses with muscle fibers called motor end plates or neuromuscular junctions. You can go back to chapter B3.3 for an overview of that. When action potentials reach a motor end plate, a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine is released. This is the chemical signal that initiates contraction of the sarcomeres in that area of the muscle, leading to the shortening of the muscle and movement of a bone. Okay, so at the end of these, you've got this axon of a motor neuron. It branches out. Each little branch has has a synapse that connects to a part of a fiber of a muscle, and there you've got a synapse. And the neurotransmitter that's diffusing over that gap that gets when the nerve impulse gets there is acetylcholine, specifically. Okay, and when that acetylcholine hits the other side, it has a cascade reaction which initiates the contraction of sarcomeres in that muscle. So it takes the sarcomeres in that fiber muscle pull together. Okay, and when you pull together, it moves the bone. The muscle gets shorter, and that moves the bones. So, for example, like if I push here, this is, I'm shortening the muscle there. I'm pulling on the muscle, and the muscle being pulled makes the bones move. Okay. C3.1.8, nerve fibers. Nerves as bundles of nerve fibers of both sensory and motor neurons. Ooh. So you can have sensory and motor neurons bundled up together. Use a transverse section of a nerve to show the protective sheath and myelinated and unmyelinated nerve fibers. The terms nerve and neuron are not interchangeable. A neuron is an individual cell of the nervous system, whereas a nerve is a collection of neurons surrounded by a protective sheath. Okay, we saw that before with the bundle in the cross-section. There were all these little circles that showed all the neurons. Neurons may be sensory, motor, or interneurons. An individual neuron is either sensory or motor, depending on whether it is carrying action potentials towards or away from the CNS. An individual neuron cannot be mixed. However, a nerve is the term used for a bundle of neurons surrounded by a protective sheath. A sheath is like a covering. Like you put a knife into a sheath to hold it. Sheath is like a cover. Sensory neurons carry action potentials from receptors to the CNS. Motor neurons carry action potentials from the CNS to a muscle. Interneurons are located between sensory and motor neurons and are only found within the CNS. So interneurons are only in the spinal cord and the brain. Some of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, cranium, head nerves, cranial nerves, only contain sensory neurons, while others only contain motor neurons, and others contain some of each type. So you can have a nerve, which is a bundle of neurons, that has both types of neurons. These two types of neurons are not connected to each other. They're just bundled up together. So they're still running their own pathways, doing their own thing, but they can be bundled up in the same nerve together. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves may contain both sensory and motor neurons, carrying action potentials in opposite directions. Nerves that contain both sensory and motor neurons are called mixed nerves. That's intuitive. There you go. Okay, so here we have this picture, a section view of an area of the spinal cord showing one of the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. You can see the spinal cord with the white matter and the gray matter. The gray matter is the butterfly inside, surrounded by the white matter. And then you have this nerve coming out, and you see that this tan part is the protective sheath, and inside it are all of these bundles. Okay, and you see like a myelinated axon. You see the nodes of Ranvier, Like I'm looking here, but you're looking there or there. And unmyelinated axons also exist. Schwann cells in between the nodes of Ranvier. Neurons can be either myelinated or unmyelinated. Those that are myelinated have cells called Schwann cells wrapped around their axon, and the intervening areas where there are no Schwann cells, those gaps, we discussed this in C3.1.6, the areas between the Schwann cells are called nodes of Ranvier. The action potentials of myelinated axons are able to skip from one node of Ranvier to the next, making transmission of the action potential much faster compared to unmyelinated axons. Groupings of myelinated and unmyelinated axons are surrounded. This says surrounding by protective sheaths, but it should say surrounded. It's an error in the text. Surrounded by protective sheaths. C3.1.9, pain reflex arcs. Ooh, I'm going to talk about pain. Key understanding. Pain reflex arcs as an example of involuntary responses, so responses that you don't have control over, with skeletal muscle as the effector. Use the example of a reflex arc with a single interneuron in the gray matter of the spinal cord and a free sensory nerve ending in a sensory neuron as a pain receptor in the hand. A pain reflex arc is an example of an involuntary response and involves only 3 neurons. The first of the neurons is a receptor neuron known as a nociceptor or a pain receptor. Imagine that you accidentally hold a finger too close to an open flame. This results in nociceptors located in the skin of your finger, initiating afferent, that means sensory, afferent action potentials. These action potentials travel through your hand and eventually join one of the spinal nerves. After entering the spinal cord, the afferent, remember that's sensory, the afferent neuron synapses with a short interneuron. After entering the spinal cord, the afferent neuron synapses with, they're using synapse as a verb. It means it has a synapse with. The afferent neuron synapses with a short interneuron, also called a relay neuron, located entirely within the gray matter of the spinal cord. The interneuron synapses with a motor neuron, and the resulting action potentials goes directly to arm muscles, the effector, which moves quickly to pull your finger away from the flame. Okay, so there's nothing happening in your brain. So the signal goes up the sensory neuron, over to the relay interneuron, which connects it to the motor neuron, which yanks your hand away. Okay, so that process, that reaction, that response to pain doesn't even touch your brain. It goes through your spinal cord. That's fascinating, isn't it? You can see a picture of this. The action of pulling your finger away from the source of pain occurs much faster than truly sensing the pain. That means being aware of the pain, the conscious part of awareness of pain. The reason for this is that the sensation of pain must travel to your cerebrum to be integrated with many neural synapses before sensation is felt and a motor response formulated. That means created and sent back. The pain reflex arc has evolved to limit damage to body tissues by generating a quick reaction involving only 3 neurons. The unusual aspect of this is that the reflex arc uses skeletal muscle as the effector. tissue that is normally innervated by the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, so skeletal muscle is usually that's full of motor neurons that are connected to your frontal lobe, like conscious stuff. So usually these muscles are reacting to thoughts, like thoughts that say move your hand here and here. But they also are connected to neurons that just pass through the spinal cord that are not controlled by us. C3.1.10, the cerebellum and skeletal muscle coordination. Role of the cerebellum in coordinating skeletal muscle contraction and balance. Something you need to know. Limit to a general understanding of the role of the cerebellum in the overall control of movements of the body. Although the cerebellum is a very important part of the brain, down here, okay, associated with body movements, it does not initiate those movements. It doesn't start those movements. The initiation of muscle contractions and thus body movements is accomplished by the motor cortex of the cerebrum. That's in the posterior or the back side of the frontal lobe. Right? As soon as a movement begins, the cerebellum receives feedback impulses from the area of the body that is moving and many sense organs. Okay, so the motor cortex gets information from sensory organs. The cerebellum then sends out impulses to coordinate the movement. This results in smooth and balanced muscular activity, leading to coordinated movements. The cerebellum coordinates posture, balance, walking, hand and finger movements, eye movements, speech, and much more. The term muscle memory, often used by athletes or musicians actually, is more to do with training coordinated movements by the cerebellum than actually training muscle. Okay, so your muscles don't have memory. It's the cerebellum that holds the muscle memory. You can look at this picture. You see the cerebrum, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the cerebellum. The three main portions of the human brain, with tissue of the cerebellum highlighted in a darker color. It's not actually darker in real life. We're just showing it that way in the picture. Many body functions, including maintaining balance and coordinating movements, require interactions between all three of these parts, plus the spinal cord, which extends down from the brainstem. Okay, so the role of the cerebellum in coordinating skeletal muscle contraction and balance. That's what you need to know from that. So what part of the brain is responsible for coordinating balance and the skeletal muscles contraction? It's the cerebellum. C3.1.11, melatonin secretion and sleep patterns. Modulation of sleep patterns by melatonin secretion as a part of circadian rhythms. So modulation means if you're keeping it within the right ranges. Okay. Sleep patterns, so when you feel sleepy, when you feel awake, the actual falling asleep also is kind of part of that. So circadian rhythms, all animals have them, which is like the pattern of when you feel sleepy and when you feel awake. Students should understand the diurnal pattern of melatonin secretion. Secretion means release, production and release. Okay, so melatonin is produced and released by the pineal gland, and how it helps to establish a cycle of sleep and sleeping and waking. Okay, so the pineal gland is where melatonin is produced. Okay. A circadian rhythm is any pattern of behavior or physiology that is based on a 24-hour cycle. The most obvious pattern of a circadian rhythm is our wake and sleep cycle. Many other organisms follow a circadian rhythm for sleep. Some animals, like ourselves, are diurnal, meaning that we are more active in daylight hours. Other organisms are nocturnal and are more active at night. Evidence suggests that the circadian rhythm is largely controlled or modulated. Modulated is just a more nuanced word, meaning controlled and maintained and kept within a certain range. Control is, I think you could just say control. By a small endocrine gland called the pineal gland. So the pineal gland belongs to the endocrine system. This small gland is located near the center of the brain, between the cerebrum and brainstem. Its function is to produce a hormone called melatonin. This hormone regulates the sleep schedule. Studies have shown that melatonin levels are high during the night for diurnal animals and high during the day for nocturnal animals. So melatonin makes you feel sleepy. It's like this. It's a hormone that gets released that says, now it's time to go to sleep. And for nocturnal animals, that happens during daylight. And for diurnal, it happens during night. And this is why people who live at the extreme latitudes, such as in Sweden, where you have lots of sun part of the year and lots of darkness part of the year, often, it's often a struggle with the circadian rhythms to get that melatonin cycle the way it should be, the way it needs to be for us to be healthy. Our other studies have shown that light striking the retina of the eye inhibits melatonin production. Okay, so there's an interaction between the amount of light that you are exposed to and the amount of this sleepy hormone that you're producing. Okay, that's why you often get these recommendations to turn off the blue light and not have the screens before bed. That's not coming from nowhere. This is a big part of that reason. There's other reasons as well, but this is one of them. Because you need to have low light conditions for the melatonin production to happen. Because inhibits means stops. So light striking the retina of our eyes sends a signal to the pineal gland and stops melatonin production. Okay, we got this little graph here, a graph showing melatonin production by the human pineal gland over a time period of about 30 hours. Humans are diurnal and show increasing melatonin production soon after sunset. Okay, so here on the x-axis we have time, and it tracks 30 hours. Y-axis, you have melatonin production. That looks like probably picograms per milliliter. So melatonin per picograms per milliliter. I'm not sure what that fluid is, if it's blood or whatever it was in. Okay. Then you have this melatonin levels fall by early morning. So you can see that they were tracking this. So when the person was awake, their melatonin levels were quite low. And then when they were asleep, melatonin production increases in the evening. And it peaks in the middle of the night. That's interesting. So some sleep disorders and insomnia are related to malfunctions in this system. Not all, but some. Over a prolonged period of time, our bodies become naturally regulated to a circadian rhythm that is only interrupted by atypical events. One of those events is traveling through several time zones in a short period of time, sometimes known as jet lag. Extended viewing of television, mobile phone, and computer screens in the evening has also been shown to alter the natural circadian rhythm. Science. C3.1.12, epinephrine and vigorous activity. Vigorous is like fast and furious. Okay. Key understanding: epinephrine, also called adrenaline, secretion by the adrenal glands. So melatonin was secreted by the pineal gland. Epinephrine is secreted by the adrenal gland to prepare the body for vigorous activity. Consider the widespread effects of epinephrine in the body and how these effects facilitate intense muscle contraction. When humans encounter a stressful situation, a hormone called epinephrine, also called adrenaline, is released from glands located on the upper or superior side of each kidney. So the adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys, and not like this way on top, like if you're laying down, sitting on top, but if you're standing up and sitting on top. That's why they're using the word superior, because there are certain words that are specific for orientations in the body. Like posterior means the back side of the body, right? Anterior means the front side. Superior means top, like towards, oriented this way, or from here down, okay? Because you can't just say like top, bottom, side to side, because that gets really confusing. That depends on which way your body is oriented in space, right? If you're laying down, the top side is your belly, right? But if you're standing up, what is the top side? It's the top of your head, okay? So there are special words to describe where in the body that are independent of whether you're standing or sitting or lying or whatever. Okay? So the adrenal glands are in the superior position to the kidneys, next to the kidneys. Epinephrine release occurs as a result of a potentially harmful event, such as an animal attack, but also because some people choose recreational, fun activities that stimulate release of the hormone. Like all hormones, epinephrine is released into the bloodstream and results in numerous responses by the body. Epinephrine has widespread effects in the body, including increasing the heart rate and blood pressure, increasing the diameter of air passages so more air can be received by the lungs. That's also called dilation. Anytime you're increasing the diameter of something in the body, that's called dilation. So like people talk about your pupils dilating, that's your pupils getting bigger. Dilation, increased size of the pupils of the eyes. Increasing blood sugar levels by stimulating glycogen conversion to glucose in the liver, so making energy available. Increasing the blood supply to muscles. Epinephrine prepares us for the fight or flight response, so called because the body's resources are called upon for immediate action in response to a threat or other stimuli that requires a vigorous and immediate response. Freeze is also part of that response, and I actually think it takes a lot of energy to hold yourself very, very still. Intense muscle contractions are associated with epinephrine release. C3.1.13, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and endocrine system. Control of the endocrine system by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Students should have a general understanding, but are not required to know differences between mechanisms used in the anterior and posterior of the pituitary. So here we have a section of the human brain showing the location of the hypothalamus and the two portions of the pituitary gland. Posterior pituitary pituitary, the backside, and the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is an area of the brain that acts as a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The hypothalamus contains some receptors that are associated with autonomic nervous system functions and receives action potentials from other areas of the body that also contain this type of receptor. The hypothalamus is composed of both neurons and glandular cells. So it is a mixture of neurons, so cells from the nervous system, and glandular cells, cells from the endocrine system. The glandular cells of the hypothalamus produce hormones that either stimulate hormone release by the pituitary glands or inhibit their release. So stop them. So the pituitary glands are creating hormones that go throughout the body, and the hypothalamus is creating hormones that control those hormones. Okay, so the pituitary or the hypothalamus has hormones that act on the pituitary glands, and the pituitary glands have hormones that go out everywhere else. Often the pituitary is referred to as a singular gland, but it is actually two glands that exist as different lobes. The anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary communicate with the hypothalamus in different ways, and each secretes its own hormones. The majority of these hormones are chemical signals released into the bloodstream that regulate the homeostasis, this balance, homeostasis of various physiological factors such as metabolic rate, reproductive cell formation, and water balance. Water balance is a good example. Right. A good example is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, produced by the hypothalamus, which is sent to the posterior pituitary when needed is secreted by the posterior pituitary. Okay, so it's produced by the hypothalamus, sent to the posterior pituitary, and it can then also be secreted by the posterior pituitary. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, helps control homeostatic levels of water in the body. The hypothalamus has specialized receptors called osmoreceptors that are capable of sensing the water content of blood as it passes through the hypothalamus. Okay? So these receptors know how much water is in the blood. Osmoreceptors. Think about it, like, remember osmosis? It's kind of related to that. Okay, water. Anyway, if the water content is relatively low, the hypothalamus will send action potentials to the cells in the posterior pituitary, which then secrete ADHD into. If the water content is relatively low, the hypothalamus will send action potentials to the cells in the posterior pituitary, which then secrete ADH into the bloodstream. The target tissue of this hormone is the collecting tubules of nephrons in the kidneys. Okay, so the hypothalamus produces this ADH. It's also secreted by measuring the water content in the blood, and then it sends it down to the kidneys. When the collecting tubules, when you learn more about the kidneys, you know more about what collecting tubules are, detect ADH. So when this chemical signal arrives there, they reabsorb water that would have been released as part of urine. Okay, so it makes us keep water in that otherwise we'd be sending out. The target tissues of some other pituitary hormones controlled by the hypothalamus are shown in figure 3. Look at all that. Oxytocin, the uterine muscles, that's the muscles around the uterus, and the mammary glands, so the breast tissue that produces, specifically, that produces milk and releases the milk. Okay, the H targets the kidneys, and then let's see what else we got here. TSH targets the thyroid, FSH and LH, the testes and ovaries. Growth hormone, it's the entire body. Prolactin, it's the mammary glands. The hypothalamus controls the two portions of the pituitary gland separately. Both the anterior and posterior pituitary produce hormones involved with homeostasis. TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is luteinizing hormone. Okay, so you can actually buy ovulation detection kits from the pharmacy or really cheaply from Amazon. They're little paper sticks, and if you pee on them and you're ovulating, meaning your ovary is releasing an egg for fertilization, it measures your LH hormone in your urine, right? So it will know if you're like having a spike in LH, which is I think that's how most of them work, right? Knowing whether or not you're ovulating. So when you're ovulating, you have this spike in LH in your blood.